Okay, I'll make a start. Morning, everyone.
Morning, George.
I am going to read Romans chapter 4. So it's Romans chapter 4, and from the first verse. What then shall we say that Abraham our forefather according to the flesh has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wages is not reckoned as a favour, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from his works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven, and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. Is this blessing then upon the circumcised or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned, while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all who believe, without being circumcised, that righteousness might be reckoned to them, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. For the promise to Abraham, or to his descendants, that he would be heir of the world, was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is nullified. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. For this reason, it is by faith that it might be in accordance with grace, in order that the promise may be certain to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, a father of many nations have I made you, in the sight of him who believed, even God, who gives life to the dead, and calls into being that which does not exist. In hope against hope he believed, in order that he might become a father of many nations, according to that which had been spoken, so shall your descendants be. And without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully assured that what he had promised he was able to perform. Therefore also it is reckoned to him as righteousness. Now not for his sake only was it written that it was reckoned to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be reckoned as those who believe in him, who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He was delivered up because of our transgressions, and he was raised because of our justification. I'm sure you'll agree that's rather complex. And it doesn't matter how old you get and how often you've studied it, I can promise you this much, it's still complex. Though sometimes it's a little bit clearer than it used to be. But I'm sure it was very clear to those first hearers, because Paul is wrestling with the problem of the Jews, the circumcised, some of them saying, you've all got to be circumcised. That includes Gentiles. Well, it is the Gentiles by definition. And he's dealing with this problem. In what way are we justified? And of course he goes right back into their history. And he cites Abraham, because it's from Abraham that everything starts, the father of many nations. And he's posing this question to them. When was Abraham justified? Was it before he was circumcised, or was it after? And he then says, as they all knew, because it's really a rhetorical question, because they all knew the answer, Abraham was justified by faith. God made promises to Abraham, and Abraham believed those promises. And it was believing those promises, trusting in God, that justified Abraham. And he wasn't circumcised at that point. So therefore, Abraham was justified in the sight of God before he was circumcised. And then, of course, later he was given the sign of circumcision as a seal. Circumcision was only a seal. It did set him apart, of course, from the other people around him, but he was justified by faith. Being circumcised, of course, would be a work. And we're not justified by works. We are justified by our faith. And that is the main thrust of his argument here. Now he also, just to back up the argument, then goes to another character that they'd all be familiar with, and that is King David. Now King David is also justified by faith. But we know enough about David to know that he wasn't exactly perfect. And so he quotes David, "Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven, and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account." Now David knew a great deal about this, because he was such a person. He's saying, I'm blessed, and everybody else is blessed, whose lawless deeds are not taken into account by God. In other words, if you trust in what the Lord has revealed, you are justified. There is nothing you can do to justify yourself, even if you try. In fact, the law, this chapter argues, condemns you. The very second you break the law, whether you call it the Ten Commandments, or whether you extend that to all the other laws that were passed, the second you break even one of them, and bear in mind, it's not just doing things, it's not doing the things that you know you should do, and it's also your thoughts. So even if you do everything you should do, and you do all, and you outwardly do everything law requires, let's face it, the second you've thought something wicked that you'd like to do, that's it, and you're finished. Without grace, you are finished. And you can't go back and undo it. So therefore, the law always condemns you. We are given the law so that we would recognize ourselves for what we are, sinners, undeserving of the mercy of God. And Paul's arguing that. He says we're all saved by God's grace if we have trusted in the Lord. And there's no distinction here between the Jews and the Gentiles. We're all saved on the same basis. That's what his long argument is. Now you can go into the details and think, oh wow, this is really complicated. And I suppose his argument is somewhat complicated, but it obviously needed to be said to the Roman church. As I say, verse 9 is a rhetorical question. Is this blessing then upon the circumcised or upon the uncircumcised? It's a rhetorical question. They all knew the answer. You can almost hear them shouting back at him, assuming they did. Before! And that must have struck at the hearts of some of them, especially those who were pushing for circumcision, thinking, oh dear, our whole argument's in trouble here. But of course, it's a good idea when you put forward an argument to listen to counter-arguments and weigh up the evidence. And if the other evidence is overwhelming, it's a good idea to adjust accordingly. And I always say that God over time reveals more and more to you. And you ought to change according to what God has revealed to you, and not be dogmatic and say, I got it right first time. There are a lot of things whereby I've changed as I've discovered more and more from God's Word. And Paul is trying to win people over here into believing this is what God has revealed. You can't deny this, because what I'm quoting to you is all revealed in the Scriptures. And you're not going to argue with that, surely. Abraham received those promises, and David himself said that a man was blessed if he was justified by God. He then goes on to expand his argument. For in verse 13 he says, For the promise to Abraham, or to his descendants, that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Now notice that interesting thing that Paul has said. He doesn't say that Abraham would be the heir to Israel. Heir of the world. He'd been promised that he would be the father of many nations. In fact, it even goes on to say that God said to him, I have made you the father of many nations. So right from the start in that promise, God was saying to Abraham, I am going to make you a blessing to the entire world. Your inheritance is the entire world. Now, without that promise, you and I wouldn't be here. Because I'm not a Jew. Not physically, anyway. We know from some of his other arguments, though, that you are an heir descended from Abraham if you are circumcised in heart. Because Paul later on does make that argument. He talks about the circumcised in heart when he's on about the same issue, by the way, about those who were saying you need to be circumcised. And Paul says to them, these people are circumcised in heart. They have trusted in the Lord. And they are justified, just like you are. And so God's promise to Abraham, which Abraham believed, was that he would be a father of many nations. Indeed, he would be heir of the world. Now, can you imagine what that must have felt like to Abraham? Because there he is. To say he was getting up in years would be an understatement, because Paul reminds them that he was 100 years old. And that Sarah was also past the years of childbearing age. They didn't have any children. How was God going to carry out his promise? Well, Abraham had no idea. But Abraham believed God and trusted that God was able to carry out what he had promised. Now, we may have made some other mistakes on the way, but we know God carried out that promise by giving to them Isaac. And it's through this lineage that God started to carry out his promise of being heir of the world. And here we are. Now, maybe somebody will correct me on this, because this figure tends to vary slightly with the passage of time. I believe that one of our strap lines when we are trying to convey to people who we are and how widespread the work is, we're in 110 nations. Is that still the figure?
Give or take. More
Anyway, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, we agree.
And when we are giving these figures, we should be thinking about, this is what God promised. He promised Abraham that he would be a father of many nations. And here we are. God is still, centuries later, carrying out that promise that he gave to Abraham. And you and I are part of that. We are part of the promise in that we have received the Lord, and we're also part of the promise is that we are going on to win others over, for them to be grafted in, and they are part of the promise. God keeps his promises. And this was a promise he made to just one man. One man, by the way, whom he chose. And I can't think of any particular thing about Abraham that made him special and more favourable to God than anyone else. God just chose him. God does that. At some point, way back in time, before I was even so much as a gleam in my mother's eye, God knew he'd choose me, and he knew he'd choose you. God chooses whom he chooses. And we do read in verse 17, because God chooses who he chooses, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you. That's what he had to say to Abraham. See, Abraham, I promised you that I would make you a father of many nations. And you know what? I've done it, and I'm still doing it. The Apostle Paul himself would have been more aware of this than most people, because it had been promised that he would be God's instrument to go outside of the people of Israel to the Gentiles. Now, Paul didn't do that instantly, but through circumstances where he was rejected, or the message was rejected, Paul went to the Gentiles. And here, of course, he is addressing the Romans. Paul himself realized, I am an instrument in God carrying out the promise he made to our father Abraham all those years ago. He's a father of us all, by the way, the Romans, not just to those who are physically Jews. Because he's addressing people in front of him, written to them who wouldn't have been of the circumcision. And so this is what I say. God has only ever had one plan for salvation. We can see in the whole promise he made to Abraham that the promise wasn't just to the Jews. The promise was to everyone who believes. This was always the plan. He didn't have two plans. Oh, by the way, my plan for the Jews is stalled a bit. It's a bit like Brexit. No, it's all gone a bit of chaos because they're not believing me anymore, not in sufficient numbers. Oh, well, we'll just have, what kind of as a backup plan? Oh, I'll tell you what, I'll go to the Gentiles. This is plan B. That was never the case. Abraham understood that he was going to be the father of many nations right from the start. There's only ever been one plan. God's plans don't fail. God's plans might not pan out in the way that we imagine, because I find we're prone to that. I think that when we look at some prophecy that's yet to be fulfilled, and we imagine how it's going to be fulfilled, I've come to realize that if I think it's going to be fulfilled in a particular fashion, I can be certain of one thing. I'm wrong. Because it's usually the case that God fulfills it in a very different fashion, but he does fulfill it. An example of this that I like to quote is that they imagined that Jesus was going to be some sort of conqueror, and they were told Elijah would come first. So in their minds they thought Elijah was literally going to come. But what it meant was a type of Elijah would come. If they'd studied it properly, they would realize a type of Elijah will come. And that type of Elijah was John the Baptist. But they weren't expecting him. And they weren't expecting Jesus. But God fulfilled his promise, but not in the way that a lot of people imagine. And I think that's just as true of us. We imagine that God's going to carry out his promise on a schedule, our schedule, and he's going to do it exactly this fashion. I'm sure even Abraham couldn't have comprehended precisely how God was going to carry out his promise to him. But he did the one and only most important thing. The one thing you have to do. He just believed God. It looked impossible. But he didn't shake in his faith. He might have shaken in his methods, right? But he didn't shake. He still believed that God was somehow going to carry out that promise, even although it ought to have been physically impossible, with him being so old and his wife not being exactly a youngster either. But God carried out that promise. And what's more true, I note that when he was given this promise, God didn't start to carry it out straight away. He still had to wait a number of years before he got Isaac. Those have been trying years. Did God really say this? Yeah. How reliable is God? Totally reliable. Right now, he still hasn't started in his promise to me, but I know that he will. Because otherwise, if God wasn't going to carry out this promise, then he wouldn't have promised it at all. And I think that we have a tendency to make some of God's promises smaller than they really are. As I say, I've changed my mind on a lot of things, and I thought, well, God's promises was to the Jews, but I've come to realize God's promises to Abraham and to the Jews is far, far bigger than I at first realized as a young Christian. God's promise concerned the whole world, not just one people group. It was enormous. Arguably one of the biggest promises God ever made. The only thing I can think of is bigger than that is Jesus Christ himself. That's if you grade them according to size. Maybe you don't do that. But as I say, it's a big and wondrous thing, and there was not two plans. You and I are still part of God's one and only plan. It's just taken a long time, and it may make a long time yet before Jesus returns. But until Jesus returns, God is still carrying out that promise to Abraham of making him a father of many nations, not just one. And if you're circumcised in heart, you are part of that. You are part of that community that God is gathering together over the centuries. And our father in the Lord is Abraham. Because God told him that. You will be a father of many nations. And I still think there's a lot to feast upon in this chapter. I don't think I could ever tire of it. Because it is complex, but he's making a good argument that is foundational to our faith. And he would have been under a lot of pressure at the time from those who opposed him. Paul himself never wavered in the belief. This is what Abraham was promised. This is what Abraham understood. And I'm telling you, this is what God has promised, and God is carrying it out. And I'll leave you with that thought. Amen.